Okay, let's just say it. The whole conversation around men and boys today, it's a lot. It's confusing. You hear all these terms thrown around. Toxic masculinity, the crisis of masculinity, positive masculinity, and honestly, it just feels like everyone's shouting into the void. So, what is actually going on?
This quote from Frederick Douglass really gets to the core of it. And when he said force, he didn't just mean muscle. He meant personal power, agency, the ability to actually shape your own life and find some dignity in that. It makes you wonder, right? In our world, which is changing at lightning speed, where are men even supposed to find that force, that sense of self, anymore?
So, that's what we're going to dig into. We're going to follow the breadcrumbs. We'll start with the hard science, the biology. Then we'll move into the classroom and the home. And we'll finish up in the wild world of the internet to try and piece together a clearer picture.
All right, and to really get this, we have to start at a pretty surprising place. Not with culture, but with chemistry. Yeah, because it turns out there's a real, measurable biological story happening under the surface that might just be the foundation for everything else.
And this isn't just a theory or some clickbait headline. We're talking about multiple studies confirming a major, population-wide drop in testosterone levels in men over the past few decades. Just pause and think about that for a second. This isn't a feeling or a trend. It's a physiological shift happening on a massive scale that could be affecting health, mood, you name it.
So what's causing this? Well, researchers are pointing to a kind of 1-2 punch from our modern world. First, you've got these things called endocrine-disrupting chemicals, or EDCs. They're basically everywhere, in plastics, soaps, lotions, and they seriously mess with our hormonal signals. And then there's the second hit, excess body fat. Fat tissue isn't just there. It's actually an active hormonal factory, and it produces an enzyme that literally turns testosterone into estrogen. The more excess fat, the more that conversion happens. But this story isn't just about what's happening inside the body. It continues in the places where boys actually grow up, because the challenges they're facing can start super early, in two of the most important places you can imagine, school and home.
I mean, just look at this data coming out of our schools. Boys are diagnosed with ADHD 4 times more often than girls. That's not a small gap. That is a huge chasm, and it can completely define a boy's relationship with learning from the get-go.
And this table really shows us why that gap might exist. When teachers see ADHD symptoms in boys, it often looks like hyperactivity, disrupting the class. But in girls, it often comes across as being quiet and inattentive. So what happens? A boy with the exact same condition might get labeled a problem child, while a girl is just seen as a daydreamer. And that has massive consequences for who gets disciplined and who gets help. And this thread continues from the classroom right into the home. Decades of research on what happens when a father figure is absent, whether physically or just emotionally, paints a really stark picture. As you can see, it's connected to a whole cascade of issues, from struggling in school to higher risks of depression, a crisis of identity, and just profound loneliness. It really highlights how crucial that paternal presence can be. So, we've got school and we've got home. But today, there's a third place where young men are being raised, and that's the digital world. And wow, is the screen shaping identity in ways we are only just starting to figure out.
Researchers actually have a name for something that's totally unique to our time: algorithmic foreclosure. It's a pretty wild idea. Basically, it's when a young person decides who they are, thinking they've seen all the options, but they have no idea that their entire journey was being secretly guided by an algorithm.
Just imagine what that feels like. From your side of the screen, it feels like total freedom. You're scrolling, you're exploring, you're finding your people. You genuinely believe you're seeing the whole world and making your own choices about who you want to become.
But here's the catch. The algorithm's only job is to keep you engaged, so it's constantly feeding you more of what you already like, reinforcing some ideas while making others totally invisible. You're exploring a reality that was custom-built for you, but you can't see the walls, and you're building your entire identity based on what's inside that bubble. And this digital world has some very real and sometimes harsh consequences, especially when it comes to dating. This stat from major dating apps is just staggering. Half of all of women's likes go to just the top 15% of men. Think about what that means for the other 85%. It creates this incredibly brutal, competitive environment where the vast majority of men can feel completely invisible and powerless, all mediated by a piece of code.
So, okay, when you stack all of this up, the biological stuff, the struggles at school, the weird realities of online dating, it's not really a surprise that it can spark a pretty intense psychological reaction. And for some, that reaction has been to build an entire identity around this feeling of being, well, injured by it all.
The philosopher Nietzsche actually had a word for this: ressentiment. It's a bit of a deep concept, but the gist is this. It's what happens when people who feel powerless
don't try to get power for themselves. Instead, they invent a new moral code where their own weakness is seen as a virtue, as good, and the strength of the people they resent is reframed as evil.
Political theorist Wendy Brown describes this as an attachment to one's own wound, and she says it gets to the point where the wound itself becomes your identity. Let that sink in. The injury isn't just something that happened to you anymore. The injury is you. Your whole sense of who you are is defined by that grievance.
And you can see this exact dynamic playing out in some corners of the internet in what's called the manosphere. Men are often framed as these injured subjects. All that complex frustration and pain we've been talking about gets channeled outward. And in that story, complicated problems get a simple answer. It's the fault of groups like feminists or so-called social justice warriors who are blamed for this perceived loss of power.
So, with all of these pressures swirling around, where does masculinity even go from here? Well, the sources suggest we're basically standing at a fork in the road. There are two fundamentally different ideas about the future taking shape, two completely separate paths forward. On one side, you have what's called the reactionary path. This path looks at the modern world and basically says, let's go back. It argues for a return to a more traditional version of masculinity, one that's based on physical strength, dominance, and a clear rejection of feminism. The core idea is that the answer to today's confusion is to reclaim an older, supposedly more essential way of being a man. And then on the other side, you have the progressive path. This path says, nope, the old rules don't work anymore. It's all about building a positive masculinity by changing what we even mean by strength, including things like emotional expression, caring for others, and focusing on real partnership and equality. The vision here isn't to go back, but to build something new entirely.
Which brings us right back to that fundamental question we started with. In a world that will not stop changing, what does strength even mean anymore? What is that force that gives a man his dignity today? And look, this isn't just some philosophical debate. The answer is going to shape our families, our workplaces, our entire future. And it's a question that every single one of us is going to have a hand in answering.